Everybody, welcome to today's episode of The Suspense is Killing Me. I am joined by the one and only Coy Hall. What's going on, Coy?
Glad to be here, Lucas. Thanks for having me.
All the way from West Virginia.
West Virginia to Virginia, yes.
Yes, we were talking before the show. You are the second West Virginian on the show, even though Brian Bowyer can't. He's not in West Virginia anymore. He's in Ohio, so we'll give him a pass.
You can never leave. It's always a part of you. Yeah.
That's right. So yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you coming on the show. You've got a very busy week at the time of this publication. You are literally in the fire. You are releasing a book. And we'll talk a bit about that. We also want to talk a little bit about your back catalog and a little bit about what got you here. You're a historian, freaking awesome. First historian on the show, by the way.
Proud
You and I
moment.
have, yeah, for the moment, you and I have nerded out a bit about some international conflict, all previous, not current. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk in particular about the applications of your fiction, because it's different than a lot of what I've had on the show in the past. I mean, we've had all kinds of stuff. We've had grief horror, folk horror. We've had more extreme stuff. We've had all the good stuff, collections, anthologies, novels, novellas, all the things. And yours will be one of the first times we've actually covered like historical fiction and its relevance to some of the more generally read horror fiction, thriller, suspense, all the kinds of stuff. And where better to pull those influences from than but the past, you know?
Nothing is bad. I mean, there's nothing scarier than the real things that have occurred, and there's nothing worse than things that real humans have done. So really can't, if you draw from that, um,
Yeah.
you can't surpass it. And
Yeah.
so that's something that has always drawn me to writing historical fiction and horror and historical settings. Like that's it's all already there, to talk about.
Right. Now we're not talking about retro writing like putting stuff in the 80s, guys. We're talking about
Right.
going back. Going back.
Right.
So just to kind of open that door a little bit about the historical applications. Um so when did you become a historian? When did this happen? When did you make up your mind to become a historian?
I always wanted to do both. When I was a teenager, I wanted to write and I wanted to be a historian. I didn't necessarily want to write nonfiction. I didn't want to write histories. I was always interested in writing fiction, but I also wanted to be a historian. So I remember when I was going through school that, professors would say, well, you can't do both. You got to pick. But I don't think that's true. You don't have to do that. And so really, I knew what I wanted to do from age 16, that I wanted to write. I began writing then. I began studying history then, and I just worked my way through and kind of kept both of those. It didn't. What's interesting, I think, is that it didn't dawn on me to combine the two
Mm.
at first. I tried to write contemporary fiction, so I was trying to, but when I got to thinking, I couldn't compete with Stephen King, and I can't compete with these people who are just, uber popular who are writing contemporary fiction. So I thought the one thing you can do is set the same type of stories that you're writing, but set them in eras that people don't often write about. People write a lot about the Second World War, and they write a lot about the American Civil War, but they don't write a lot about like the 17th century, the 30 Years' War. I was thinking, a lot about those things, so why don't you
Mhm.
just set your story and those eras? And that's really when I kind of found my path.
Excellent. And I mean, a lot of authors that like to write books, particularly in the horror genre and even some thrillers, they like to lean more into like the gothic kind
Mhm.
of elements of those time periods. Did you find yourself interested in becoming or writing more in the gothic space, or what kept you from maybe identifying as a gothic writer?
Well, I I do kind of think of myself as writing with kind of some gothic trappings, especially the decaying castles and and the look of gothic fiction. I also use folk horror a lot, drawing from folk traditions and things like that. So maybe the lack of romance in my novels probably maybe keeps it from the Gothic genre from being firmly in the Gothic tradition, because I do think that's an important part of Gothic writing.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, I think some people at a very high level would say, Gothic, haunted by something from the past or influenced by something from the past, lots of emotion,
Right,
dark, preferably back in those time periods, if you really
right.
want to get down into the craziness of it. But not true, right? Like there has to be a romantic element, or maybe
I
not true, but like
I think
it's a
so. I think it's an important element to it. I mean, it's if you're talking about, pure Gothic fiction and you read, I mean, the 18th century Gothic authors, that is an important element to
Mhm.
those stories.
Right.
And, but I do think in terms of, like, the aesthetic and just the feel and the buildings and the emphasis on decay, that's always something that's important to me in my writing,
Mhm.
is emphasizing the decay of people and their time and their
Mhm.
place, and I do feel like that has a kind of a Gothic, um there's a Gothic vein running through that.
Wow. So what do you think it is about that theme that kind of resonates with you that keeps coming back?
Well, you know, I when I look back at these time periods and, I read these stories of these people, and I think about kind of comparing it to modern times. Would when you see, like, when you're going through, public school and you're learning about history, they always learn about the high points. People are always achieving, everything's always progressing. But
Mm,
when you really get into, like, more nuanced history, you see there are places that come and go, and people, these towns decay, right? They'll rise and then they'll fall just like people. And that's always been an interesting element to me, that these regions, these parts of Europe that, are prosperous for a while and then they begin to decay and they're kind of outside of the mainstream. It's not Vienna that you're talking about in Austria. It's the Styrian highlands, where it's they're suffering kind of economic depression and things like that. That level of decay and the old buildings that are left behind. It's always been a fascinating thing to me. There's old military fortresses that
oh
were
yeah.
there to, like, protect against the Ottomans, the Turks, and the fact that those have been left behind and they're just decaying and they're part of the landscape. That's always attracted me, just that visual, rather than, say, Paris or London in that time, these
Mm,
prosperous areas, these kinda outside the mainstream, and, element of decay is really always in my stories. You kinda I like to ground it by starting it in a known area, but then moving it into, one of these more kinda decaying backward places, in 17th century Austria, place something like that.
God, it just sounds cool, man.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is there, I mean, obviously we could draw some pretty clear comparisons to our own lives, right? In that and say,
Yeah.
we're in a constant state of decay. It's funny because when I was an engineer, we studied corrosion quite a bit. It's a very costly problem for us. And we used to, we used to tell the guys, hey, look, you're fighting nature. This is simply refined metal trying to go back to its natural state. Like you can't
Right.
prevent nature from doing what it does, but you can slow it.
Right.
Do you feel like we kind of just have that built into our nature that no matter how much progress we make, we're constantly fighting our own decay?
Yeah, well, it's that idea of, like, things fall apart. If you
Yeah.
have that as a worldview, things fall apart, and, maybe even more interesting than that is that when you're in the middle of things falling apart, you're always in denial about it too. You tell yourself, like, the lie of progress, and we're gonna make it out of this. And so I think, characters in those areas can be very familiar to our time. Yes, they existed 400 years ago, but they're experiencing the same type of denial that we experience now when we're in the middle of, a decaying area.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's pretty deep stuff. Dude, I don't think I've ever gotten this deep in the first 10 minutes of a show.
I try. Just wait till minute 40.
Yeah. Coy brought the darkness.
Right.
That's awesome,
Yeah.
man.
We're not gonna leave with any hope.
Yeah. That's right. There shall be no hope. So real quick, for those that may be unfamiliar with your catalog, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what you've done. Not all of what you've done because you've done a lot. If you guys go to coyhall.com, you'll see what I'm talking about. Coy's got all of his novels and collections listed on his website, and there's a lot of short story work that you've done as well. But we're pretty much looking at 6 main titles on your site here. A couple of collections and a couple of novels. And I love that you pull, even though you have a lot of the same themes resonating, they are not the same stories. Like you have very different times, locations, all the things. I mean, very different. I'm looking at the Hangman Feeds the Jackal is nothing like the Promise of Plague Wolves,
Right,
right?
right, yeah.
Um, so can you talk a little bit about the Promise of Plague Wolves? Like what inspired you to write that story? What are we looking at here? What is this?
So, yeah, I would really like to talk about that because
Okay,
that's I think that book more than any other up to this point represents my style and my just my kind of vision for horror stories and how to go about them. But so this story is set in 1686 in Austria, and at that time, the in this story there is a smallpox. Um, it's I mean, smallpox was like a plague still at that point, and when
sure,
smallpox would be unleashed on a community, it was devastating. And so it's at a time when Styria, which is a part of Austria, Styria is being blocked off and quarantined for a smallpox outbreak. And so the military, kind of keeping travelers from not going in, not going out. And the main character is named Doran Toth, and Doran Toth is a character that I had built up in a couple of short stories, but he is a paranormal investigator. For lack of a better term, he's an occult detective, but the 17th century version of an occult detective. So think about like 1686. To put that in context, like the Salem witch trials are 1692. So if you think about that era, right, that's when he lives, and that's how he looks.
mhm,
And the but he's from Hungary, and he is a part of an order within the Catholic Church called the Order of Saint Gwynfort. And Saint Gwynfort is a real saint from the 13th century in France who is
okay.
a greyhound, a dog, like he's a dog saint.
Hold on a
And
second. He's a saint that's a dog?
right, he is.
Really?
He's a folk saint, right? So he's not like so the church kind of embarrassed of him, but on a local level,
Okay.
he is revered as a saint and has healing powers, and people would take their sick kids to Saint Gwynfort. Saint Gwynfort has this great backstory in France, and he was a dog who was accidentally killed, but he was actually protecting a baby. But the owner thought that he was trying to hurt the baby, so he killed the dog
Wow.
and felt remorseful and put a nice burial in the forest. And so he became a saint, and people would take their sick kids and leave it on the grave of Saint Gwynfort the child overnight. Not a good idea, right? Go leave your kid in the forest, but nevertheless, there you have it. If you go there the next day and the kid's not there, that did happen. And
That's crazy.
but other times they'd go and say that the kid was healed. That's all backstory. So Saint Order of Saint Gwynfort, the tie-in here is that the investigators all have a greyhound with them.
Hmm.
So all the occult investigators in the order have a greyhound with them, tracing them back to this Saint Gwynfort. And so Doran Toth's dog is named Vinegar Tom, right? Vinegar Tom, and he's a greyhound, and he accompanies Toth on all his investigations. So in the short stories, all the future novels I want to write, it's Toth and his dog, right, going around and confronting my dog in the background there is barking right now, but
He is supporting your decision to include a dog in the story, which
but so So the story though is about Toth and Vinegar Tom. They're sent into Styria in 1686, and they investigate not only what's going on there, but there's this occult plague that's going on behind smallpox, and they unravel the mystery, and that's what The Promise of Plague Wolves is about.
Nice. You have beautiful titles, by the way. I love your
Thank you.
titles.
Thank you.
Um, okay, I gotta ask, what made you decide to name the dog Vinegar?
All right, so I have to like, kind of give up my secret on that. On
Am I allowed to ask?
yeah,
Okay.
because this is from a real witchcraft case in
Uh,
real life, right? Do you know you've heard of Matthew Hopkins? He was
hmm,
in the English Civil War. He was the Witchfinder General. All right, there's a Vincent Price horror movie in the '60s called Witchfinder General about Matthew Hopkins.
nice.
He's a real figure. He was self-appointed. No government's going to call you the Witchfinder General, by the way. You got to call yourself that, right? Obviously,
Wait, so
nobody.
what are you going to? Are you going to be at StokerCon 24? Maybe,
No,
maybe not.
no,
Okay,
no, no
because if you
plans
were, I was
for
going to
that.
say you need to put that on your name tag so that when I see you, it's like,
Witchfinder General, yeah. But he, was a horrible human being. He was an absolutely horrible human being, and he was an investigator of witchcraft, and he would kinda, lack of better term, torture people, and he would kinda get this information out of them. And one of the cases, he had this old woman who talked to animals.
hmm,
And that's what she did, she really did. She just seemed like a nice old lady who was feeding wildlife, by the way, when you look back at the case, but she had all these animals, and he called them her familiars, right? They were like the go-betweens between Satan and this old woman,
hmm,
and she named them one was Vinegar Tom, and one was Greedy Gut, and I always liked those names, and I thought, "I gotta use Vinegar Tom and
awesome,
Greedy Gut," and so both of those are names are used in the book. There's another dog in the book, a Great Pyrenees named Greedy Gut, so, that's also from the Matthew Hopkins trial,
nice.
and those are real from the real court records in the Hopkins cases, so
See, guys, you never know what you're going to find here. That is so cool.
it's bizarre, but it's just like, um, couldn't resist,
Yeah,
couldn't
no,
resist.
I mean, how could you? That's amazing. I love that. And so you just released that. Let me look here. That was released in September, right?
September 12th, yeah,
Yeah,
it
nice.
does, yeah.
So that's got some legs on it by by now, and I'm sure you're getting a lot of feedback from readers about the story. That's really cool. What a fun time! That first 2 months after the release is pretty exciting.
It is, yeah, and it's a nervous time too,
Yeah,
you kinda put so much into these books, and you don't know how people are going to receive them, and
sure.
well, I did this book with Nose Touch Press, and um you get the back and forth between you and the editor and that, but it's really just it's still just 2 people, doing
Yep.
that when you really put it out, and this book went on NetGalley as well too, which was always a nervous situation because NetGalley is wide open, and it's not your friends reviewing the book, these
Right.
people, and but it's been very positive on NetGalley, and, everything since has been very I'm relieved to say, and
That's yeah, that's a good thing, right?
It's on the Bram Stoker Awards reading list too, it's made, so
I
for
noticed that yesterday.
yeah,
So I was looking over the email and I was like, well, look at that. I've
oh,
got a celebrity on the show.
right, yeah. You're not allowed to say what's on the reading list, I think, by, like, HWA rules technically, so don't tell anybody,
Don't tell anyone yet. I can say what I read on the list, right?
Right,
Um, okay, so a Pantheon of Thieves
right,
is a collection, right?
mhm.
So that's obviously a little different than a plague. With a Pantheon of Thieves, is this a collection of stories you've been building over the years?
It was, it dates back I think the earliest story in that collection was written in 2012.
Okay.
Dates back that far, but what it was, I had wanted to do a World War One anthology,
Hmm.
and I was gonna start a small press, and I did that. It's called The Scythian Wolf, And to fund that, I self-published through the Scythian Wolf, A Pantheon of Thieves and Other Weird Tales. And so that was what that project was. I self-published that, and it generated the money to do the World War One anthology. But yeah, I went back to 2012, just pulled together some stories that kind of fit into the weird horror genre, and just a mix of everything in there. There's stories that go back into the 30 Years' War and the 1640s. They go back that far. There's a medieval horror story, goes back to the Black Death, but it also goes all the way up to the 1980s. There's a story in 1982 in it, and there's a science fiction story that takes place in the future. And so it's just a mix, it's a good sampler if you want to kind of get a sense of my writing style. The Pantheon of Thieves is a good place to start, because there's a little bit of everything in there.
Well, I just cracked it. I want to say Sunday.
Yeah.
I just got it off of onto my Kindle and
Thank you.
just cracked into it on Sunday. So I'm really looking forward to
Thank you.
I love collections, especially when you get to kind of, it's probably just from my upbringing being a huge King fan in the 80s. You know, I think probably one of the first things I read by him was Four Past Midnight
Right. Yeah.
and Night Shift. I mean, I just love the collections because it's, you know, so many cool, interesting, fun little stories, and there feels like there's a bit of freedom in a short story like that. You can fly
Yeah.
a little faster and a little bit further in a short period of time, and the reader expects it. And if you know, if you're not careful in a novel, you can break some trust rules there.
Sure, yeah, and I do have the first story in there too. Is called "The Night of the Rat's Nest," and it is something of a teaser for the World War One horror anthology, which I'll be releasing next year. It is a story that's set during and directly after the First World War, so that's kind of a teaser for that too.
Well, that's Death's Other Kingdom, right?
Right, yeah.
Okay,
This A Pantheon of Thieves, the first story in it is a World War One set story.
gotcha.
And
Okay,
so it's a teaser for this anthology I'm doing next year.
right. And
Yeah.
the anthology is Death's Other Kingdom, right?
Death's Other Kingdom, yeah.
Okay. And that anthology is a Scythian Wolf published anthology, right?
Right, yeah.
And you do have a open. I mean, you had an open window until November 1st,
Right, we did,
right?
August the 1st to November 1st, and received over 150 short stories for that, so now the work really begins with, trying to pick what to include in the book, and what to exclude, so,
Oh, that's a lot of reading to do. Now, what are we looking at for Death's Other Kingdom as far as word count per story? That kind of.
yeah, so I wanted a kind of mix of long and short, but I set up 4,000 to 9,000 words. So I wanted substantial stories, not like short shorts, but actual I wanted world building going on
Right.
in the stories. So the final book's going to be around 50,000 words, around 200 pages, and I personally, when I'm reading anthologies, like that length, because I feel like anthologies can wear out their welcome sometimes. If they're
Yeah.
300, 400 pages and it's the same theme that you're
Yeah.
reading, it can get tiring. So I wanted to kind of keep it at 8 stories around 200 pages. That way you don't wear out your welcome. That was
Very nice.
my approach to it.
Very nice. And
That'll be out in May, hopefully, of 2024. It's called Death's Other Kingdom.
excellent. So put that on your list of things to invest in, guys. In early 24. I mean, if you're publishing that in May, are you going to do a pre-order on that, or is it too soon for me to ask that?
Oh yeah, I'll do a pre-order.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll do a pre-order. It's definitely a pre-order for the ebook. I'm not certain if I'll do a pre-order for the paperback or not yet, but
Gotcha. I heard you're going to do a special edition hardcover where it's just like images of Coy dressed in his
right, yeah.
historically relevant
My
uniforms.
my my uniform collection. I'm gonna show it off.
That's right.
I told you that in confidence before the show.
It's good.
Can't believe you betrayed me.
Yeah, I can't believe I said that. Dude, that's so cool. I'm really excited about that one, not just because World War One is such a uniquely Gosh, I mean, you talk. I mean,
Yeah,
we talked a little bit about like how much things advanced from warfare and weaponry and all the things from the late 1800s up through the first half of the 20th century. But like when you look at World War One, it was kind of this middle ground where things were
yeah,
just wild, wild west with warfare. I mean, we were like on the precipice of really having technologically advanced weaponry, but we were also very rudimentary and
right.
things were just brutal. I mean, it was like brutal applications of weaponry. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I like to think of it as having essentially as 1 foot in the 19th century and 1 foot in the 20th century. It straddles these times. And so you do get this mix of old and new. And I think that push and pull between old and new, there's a lot of drama in that. And that's one thing I wanted. That's why I wanted to do this era and these stories, because you do have airplanes, but you still have extensive use of balloons as well, and you have radio, but you also still have carrier pigeons. Horses were used extensively during the war. It really, in some ways, looks like an old 19th century war, but it's very modern in other ways. And I love that drama of the First World War. It's something that really draws me to it. I find it much more interesting than the Second World War.
Mm,
I find the First World War much more interesting to read about.
yeah. It hasn't gotten as much exposure as World War II for sure. So
Yeah, well,
it's real fresh.
right, and I think that um, I've loved reading these stories that have been submitted have been so good too, and
Mm,
that's something that's like made me really happy when I put out this open call. What you're never certain what you're going to get, and I've had received some really excellent stories and some unique stories and unique areas, not just about trenches in France, but about colonial Africa and things like that stuff that was going on during the war, and it's been really fun reading through these stories.
wow. What a crazy time. I can't wait to see that collection because yeah, I mean, I'll refrain from my little nerd excitement because we spoke before I was active duty, so I went to the war college and we studied all the different time periods of war. But that whole late 1800s, early 1900s time period, it was just if you haven't quite gotten into uh, reading about that time period, this will be a great intro to that for people because I don't think they understand how much it shapes the world we live in now and how everything changed for World War II. Like
Yeah,
you wouldn't have World War II without that.
yeah, and I think and want to emphasize this too. When I'm reading these stories and the people writing these stories, I'm not contributing a story to it. I'm just editing it, but the um, the stories are very artful about using the war as backdrop, but they're
Mm,
still horror story. They're not historical treatises, right? They're horror stories, but with all these trappings and the texture of the war, and the time period. And I think it's like when you get historical horror like that, and there's one thing that really draws me to it is it's almost like fantasy in the level of world building,
that's right.
because it's an unfamiliar time and it's an unfamiliar place you're going, and it's like fantasy or science fiction. There's this
Mhm.
world building element involved, that you can't get away with assuming somebody knows what
Right.
a telephone looks like in 1917. You need to describe, and I love that element of describing it and the kind of bringing that alive in your mind. So it's always I've
Awesome.
always loved that.
Well, not to I could talk about Death's Other Kingdom all day, by the way, because I would just you've got me excited. I want to open a small press and read short stories about World War One now
Just do it.
all day. That's what I
Somebody
want
said
to
I
do.
asked somebody if I should do that, and he said, "It's a terrible idea," and I said, "I'm gonna do it then."
Great. I'll get
"Okay,
started.
thanks." Yeah, yeah.
um, but I want to make sure we give some time to a séance for Wicked King Death. Which
Right.
first question is, please, Coy, tell me when this book is coming out.
So, this one's coming out on November 10th, and it's coming out from Shotgun Honey, and Shotgun Honey as pretty unique following. They've for crime fiction, so I was really excited to do a book with Ron Earl Phillips. He runs Shotgun Honey, and also designed the cover for it. And I was in love with the cover of it. It has this like noir feeling and like
Yes.
1940s movie poster. But the story is set in 1956,
Mhm.
and it's set between Cincinnati, Ohio, and Huntington, West Virginia. Right, so a lot of it takes place in 1956 in Huntington, West Virginia, and a small town, and so it goes from Cincinnati to Huntington, and it's set in the world of fraudulent seances and occultism. There's nothing supernatural about it. It's a crime novel, it's a noir novel, but it's set in that world where the main character Royce and Anna, they are quote unquote mediums, right? They're mediums who talk to the dead, but they're fake, and they prey on people, and it takes place in that world in the 50s.
What drew you to write about that time period? I mean, this is obviously still in our current, it's in our past, right? But
Yeah,
it's very different from the time periods that you live
right.
in
Yeah,
at work.
it's practically modern,
Yeah,
compared
yeah,
it's like yesterday. But
yes.
I think what drew me to it is because what I like to read. So I love to. So my favorite authors, like Raymond Chandler and David Goodis is one of my favorite crime authors, and he wrote Shoot the Piano Player,
Mm.
and he writes about 1950s Philadelphia, and these noir novels in the 40s and 50s, and so that is what drew me to write. I wanted to write a novel about that time period because I liked it from those books, and the language of those books, and I just wanted to. I wrote the book back in 2020 when COVID lockdown began, and I said, "Well, I don't know how long this is gonna last, so I'm gonna write a novel while we're in lockdown." And I
Oh,
and I
it's
beg
hot.
and I began it in April and finished it in May of that year, and, finally seeing it finally coming out now, so,
Nice.
yeah.
Oh, this is great. I've I'm so curious about when I heard the title, I hadn't seen the cover yet, right? So,
Right.
um, and then immediately I recognized the cover from your Twitter posts, and it's almost like the title and the cover didn't go hand in hand with me when my brain was thinking. And I think that is a testament to how cool this title is. I'm like, when you hear it as a standalone, you almost think like it's hard to put your finger on what the story is actually going to be about. But
Right.
then once you get the the book description in your head, you're like, this sounds cool. Like, where did okay, so first of all, seances and kings, like that like pulled me in totally different directions. Where where did the whole like what made you want to bring seances into this world? Like it's 1956. You could have picked
Right.
all kinds of things from that time period that are probably more commercially relevant.
Yeah.
But you pull a seance into the 50s.
Well, what's interesting about that time is there's if you look back
Mhm.
in US history, anytime we have a major war, after the war, there's a peak in interest in occultism because all the massive loss from the war, and it's
Mm.
actually a sad thing, right? That
Yeah.
people want to contact loved ones, and so there's that. This is interesting. Back in the 20s, it was that way after the First World War. Thomas Edison was working on like a spirit telephone in the 20s to talk to the dead. Thomas Edison, of all people.
That's hot.
And in the late 40s, it peaked again, and there was this interest in occultism, and seances were in vogue. Seances were in vogue into the 1960s.
Mm.
Occultism was, and so that's something I had been interested in reading about spiritualism, and not like spiritualism with a lowercase s, but the uppercase s, like the
Mm.
religion from the 19th century where they talk to the dead, the Fox sisters and stuff, where they do the table rappings and all the seances. And I thought it's after World War II, and Royce, the main character, his history in the book goes back to the late 40s and stuff. So that era and kind of builds up to the 50s. But that's why, and that's why Seance is in the 50s. So that's where that comes from. And the Wicked King Death of the title, I had always wanted to write a juvenile delinquent 1950s novel, like a crime novel in the 50s called King Death. I had this big idea. I was going to write this novel called King Death. And so I just stole that title from my other project. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. And so
That's
I made up this legend. They have this Royce in the novel tells this vaudeville story, which is supposed to be a funny story about a séance for Wicked King Death. So it's in the and he tells the story in the novel.
awesome.
And it's a vaudeville routine from the 20s that he's talking about but it's all made up if you're curious.
Yeah.
I had to link it into the title. I'm like, let me make up a quick legend here. Nobody's gonna know.
No one's
Nobody's
gonna
gonna
know.
know. Yeah.
And I was recently interviewing Rose Biggin, who wrote a book, The Belladonna Invitation, and it's set in. Rose, don't kill me if I get the dates wrong here. It's in the 1800s, 1890s, I think. Parisian society, high society, kind of super gothic, super like just saturated with gothic angst and all the good things, darkness everywhere. I don't know that I actually saw the sunshine in that book in my head at all the whole time I was reading it. But in that book, she has these things called poison salons. And if you guys have listened to the episode with Rose, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, this is going to be a good promotion for that episode. But she had these people with money and exclusive access to the higher forms of society in Paris in that time frame in her story could access this poison salon where people could basically play Russian roulette a little bit, kiss death. And I was like, where did you get that idea from? Like, she's like, just made it up. Like, it sounds like a real thing. I was like, so I'm sure your vaudeville act is going to come across perfectly.
Well, I mean, if you just people give you the benefit of the doubt. Yeah. If I'm going to present this like it's a real thing and he's telling a real story, they just assume you're. Why not? Why would you?
I want to believe it's true.
Why would you do that to me? Why would you lie to me?
You're not going to lie to me. It's got to be true. Now I'm going to spend the rest of my life believing this legend.
Yeah, don't look up the Séance for Wicked King Death vaudeville routine of the 20s. It's not there. It's all made up, and it's a story he tells in the book though. But it's a noir story, and then where it's a guy who is kind of drawn into trouble. He's drawn into the situation. He's drawn back into his past. He's trying to get away from it. It pulls him back in, and he's being set up to take the fall, for something big. And so the central story is Royce Pembrook, the main character, getting drawn into that world and having to get out of trouble.
He's going to try.
He's going to try. Yeah.
I'm looking at some praise for the book on Amazon right now, which people, if I'm looking at it on Amazon, that means you should be there buying it. Let's see here. C.W. Blackwell. This is the one I wanted to share. Coy Hall is a master of creating thrilling historical fiction novels. This is no exception, paraphrasing. With a unique premise and a cast of characters full of moxie. Nice word selection there, relevant to the book, and humorous, intelligent dialogue. Hall delivers a pulse-pounding noir novel reminiscent of Wilfred or Goodis. I like that he calls you a dream come true for pulp aficionados. So,
right, yeah.
If anyone listening is a pulp aficionado, here is your dream come true.
And I am an obsessor over pulp fiction from the 30s and 40s and 50s. Not the Tarantino movie.
Not the movie from the 90s.
That's fine. That movie's good, but I mean the actual pulp fiction from the 30s. I just love it. Love it.
Have you? Okay, I'm not going to ask you that question on air and then get us both killed. I will ask you a question later.
Okay, yeah.
It's about that time period in some writing I'm absolutely a huge fan of.
Okay.
Okay, so if you're now dabbling in the 50s,
Mhm.
uh, and you are obviously dabbling in the 50s in a very familiar area of the country for you, but a very different place than most people read about in the 50s. I mean, usually when you hear or see things about the 50s, it's either really deep South stuff or
Right.
it's like set in New York City or LA or somewhere
Right.
very popular. When you write about this region of the country,
Yeah.
and if I ever interviewed David Ray Pollock, I'm gonna ask him the same question because he's got some really cool application. Like in his books, you don't, or Donald Ray Pollock, sorry, I said David. Donald Ray Pollock, when he writes about Southern Ohio, Kentucky, kind of like there is no mistaking the influence of that area on his stories. Did you feel like when you wrote about this stretch between Cincinnati and West Virginia, right? Is that correct?
Right.
Did you feel like that area had a tremendous amount of influence on the story, or did it just happen to be a good place for this to happen?
It has a tremendous amount of influence on the characters in the story.
Hmm.
Royce, the main character, comes from old money, and he is a bit aloof. I guess he's not. He not a Cincinnati person, nor a West Virginia person. So it's kind of his how he's seeing this world, and
Mhm.
so the characters who surround him, yeah, absolutely, they're influenced by real life. All the places in the novel are real places. The Greyhound station even is the Greyhound station in Huntington today. It's Art Deco building. It's still there today, and it's described, as it exists.
You
So
think you're
yeah,
gonna freak some people out that might be reading the book while sitting there at the bus station?
I hope so. That's the goal. Yeah. The goal is that I mean, it's like Fourth Avenue and the movie theater, the Keith Albee theater is in the novel, and there's a movie, The Ten Commandments, is on the marquee there in the novel, which was out at that time, and they go to a restaurant, and he goes to, but he walks at Marshall University's in the novel, which is in Huntington, and so it's very much real in those terms, and the people too
Hmm.
are, the attitudes of the people, and it's especially attitudes of people in the 50s, those are as true to life as I could make it.
Excellent. Um, I love that for the story because I feel like it really adds flavor to a story like that when you can pull somebody away from maybe the automatic context that they build in their head for something based on their location, their world. When
Right.
you set it in a place that has a really kind of firm identity and you really integrate that into the story, I feel like it makes the story so much better.
I think it's gonna appeal to people if you know anything about the Rust Belt and the cities in the Rust Belt and the manufacturing and the
Hmm.
prosperity that was and how that's gone away, and it's an economically depressed area, and that had already began in the 1950s. It was starting to diminish, and so I think if you recognize any of those cities from New Jersey out to the Midwest, in this Rust Belt, that's probably I hope that's what's in your mind, as you're reading about Huntington, because that's the type of town that I'm talking about.
Love it. Now this book is definitely more of a thriller
It is, yeah.
than a lot of the other books that you've written. Am I
Right.
correct?
Right, those are horror novels. This one's
Right.
a crime novel, yeah.
Right. So when writing in another genre, which by the way I do as well, even in the fiction side, I've got my hands in some other places that I'm not necessarily at liberty to talk about just yet, but I understand what it's like to move between very clearly drawn but
Right.
very loosely held genres. And I say that because
Mm,
horror is so big and thrillers are so big, but there's a very clean line between a thriller that has a heavy horror focus and one that does not.
right.
Moving from writing predominantly horror to moving toward a more pure kind of pulp thriller kind of story. What did that feel like for you? Did you feel like it changed the way you told the story? Did it change character development? Did it just change plot? Like, what was that like?
It's something I've always read in a lot of genres. And so I'm very familiar with the way horror stories are structured and mysteries are structured and thrillers. And I love reading science fiction and I love reading all these genres. And so my approach to it just felt instinctive when I was going into it that I'm going to tell a crime story and I let that guide me just based on my reading of crime stories. So it wasn't like, it was never a conscious thing that I can't do the things I do. I'll tell you one way. It's one way it's very different. I didn't want to describe if you have a fight scene, right, or a murder scene, you want to build up in the crime, not in the horror novel. You want it to be in modern sense style graphic, and you show the
Right.
blood and the penetration of the knife, and you describe those things. Um, and in the crime novels, a little less of that.
Mm.
So the impact of it, there's one very graphic scene in Séance, where a man is beaten with it's a sock full of broken glass,
Oh, nice.
and it's obviously, it's picking at his face as it's hit and kind of stripping flesh from his face as it's hitting, and I did think in that when I first wrote it, it was very great. It was a horror novel style, like, it's stripping flesh off the guy's head, as he's, like, beating him with this glass sock, and, I did going back, go back and forth with editors on that. I said I was told, "This is stomach churning. You need to cut the turn down the level, of graphic violence here." And that was the one time I thought the 2 worlds collide, and I thought, "Oh, well, maybe you gotta think in terms of audience and audience expectations, and somebody reading a crime novel may not want the, ribbons of flesh on the sock." Right, like, the horror reader wants that, the crime reader, maybe not so much, so that did make me rethink.
Uh,
There's a lot of graphic violence in Seance, um, but you kinda pull back on the descriptions of the outcome, of the
right.
graphic violence a bit.
A differentiator. And I'm glad to see that you didn't like quit and protest, right? Like you,
Well, I try I like working with editors, like,
yeah,
I never really I mean, I'm a human being, and when somebody says something negative about it, I wither inside just like anybody else, like when they're kinda critiquing your work, but I do value somebody saying, "This doesn't work," or, "You need to restructure. This doesn't make sense. It's the way it's in your head is not the way it is on paper," and, I really value that, and so that was a different perspective and saying stomach churning, that's not what necessarily people want. No,
excellent.
I never thought of it didn't make me mad, it kinda made me, I tried to see it from their point of view.
It's usually the right one. When you're talking to the right editor.
Right, yeah, I
Like,
mean, if they're good at what they do, you should listen to them. They're
yeah,
they're only trying to help you improve the story, and they think about audience in a different way than you might.
that's right. So you you have to handle the suspenseful elements of a book differently when
Yeah.
you don't have the promise or thread of ribbons, being torn from someone's face. Like did you feel like handling the twists in the plot or the turns or even like hooking readers at the end of a chapter, any of that? Did you feel like the way you built suspense in this story as a pure or more pure thriller than obviously than a horror? Did you feel like there was a big difference in the handling of that in the writing of the book?
I'll admit when I write horror novels, I structure them like mystery novels.
Mm,
So I kinda came in with that framework. I do like that framework of a mystery at the heart of things and solving it.
mm,
I did try in the crime novel, the whole goal was the action of the story begins on page 2, on page 2, and it doesn't stop to the climax. It builds, 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 builds until the
excellent.
end of the story. So I did want that. I did consciously do that in this because I wanted this to kinda be a kinda build up, get you kinda pulled into the story. You're figuring out things as Royce figures them out. that's the mystery element. He's kind of feeling his way through the fog, and you're there with him and finding things out as he finds things out. There's no omnipotent narrator who knows everything. Royce tells the story, and so you figure it out along with him. And that was one conscious thing I did for building, kind of ratcheting up suspense as you go through that. Um, Especially in this novel, when there's a lot of it's, he's going to figure out people who aren't on his side but still have to interact with them, and so that's always a good use of suspense there, when he knows, the reader knows, the other person in the story doesn't know, and so
Right.
I really used that to full effect.
Now, forgive me if you've already mentioned this, and I just have a little tiny brain and I can't fit all the things in it. Royce Pembrook, is this his first? Is this his first showing in one of your stories?
Well, he was in a so as you can tell, I like building kind of series around characters.
Mhm.
So Doran Toth's going to have a series. Elijah Valero and Hangman Feeds the Jackal has short stories. He's going to have more novels, and Royce Pembrook is too. So Royce Pembrook, the first short story I had a short story published in Guilty Crime Story Magazine, and it's called Tibet Has a Book of the Dead Too.
Mm.
Tibet Has a Book of the Dead Too, and it was the first Royce Pembrook story, and it's back in the 40s when he's like ripping people off on the carnival circuit.
So, when you wrote him then, did you know there was gonna be something for him
I,
later, like a full novel, or did it
I
just kind
did.
of
I wrote the first. I wrote the first two novels. There's another. I'm on next year. Next year, there's going to be another Royce Pembrook novel called The Switchblade Svengali that comes out, and um, um,
I love that.
but the Switchblade Svengali is his second novel. So, and I have a third novel planned for him, and I want to write more short stories. But I like him as a character, and I think something that's interesting about Royce too, that I interested in the drama of it in the 50s, is that he's an openly gay man in the 1950s, and being an openly gay man in small town America in the 1950s. Um, was really set up a lot of interesting character stuff for me with his interactions with people.
Was he the first openly gay character that you've written? I mean, you may have written other gay characters, but were they openly gay or?
No, this in my first published novel that I actually has, but yeah, so this would be my first novel that has an openly gay protagonist in it.
Hmm. Did you feel motivated to do that for any other reason than when you started to write him? It was, he just felt like that was the right character, or was there?
Yeah, that's who he was. That it came to me that that's who Royce was, and it developed organically.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I love that. And I mean, that can add a whole, I mean, especially in the 50s, that can add a whole layer to that story that would not exist had he not been.
Right. Well, that's the contrast in this next book, The Switchblade Svengali. He goes out to Phoenix. It's set in Phoenix
Hmm.
in 1968. Right, and it's a very different world in 1968 Phoenix than it is in 1956 Huntington and Cincinnati. And so that contrast was interesting too, about attitudes beginning to change, and attitudes in Phoenix are different than kind of this river town, Ohio river towns. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that's really cool. Are you? I mean, you got a busy 2024 coming up. My brain is
Yeah.
stacking your dates. It's like,
Well, so for next year I have Death's Other Kingdom,
yep.
The Switchblade Svengali, and I have my first science fiction novel coming out, and it's called
Oh.
Colossus with a Poisoned Tongue, and it's going to be out next year too. So
I've got to ask because like you and I were just talking about a few minutes ago, I dabble in another genre, um, but I've had more people warn me about crossing genre lines than I can count, and I always laugh about that. I'm like, it'll be okay. I can understand, you don't want to confuse readers. I think it's just about being transparent about what the story is.
I I've received that same advice, and
Yeah.
I imagine it's correct.
Right.
I imagine they know what they're talking about. But that's not what I'm passionate about. I wanna tell
Right.
stories in different genres. My main genre is horror stories. I'll always go
Yeah.
back to those horror novels, but I like to write other novels. I've written a Western now and a crime novel,
Mhm.
and I'm writing a science fiction novel, and if I like to read it, I want to write it, and I'm going to do that. It's is, it may there's a difference between what's best for your career and what's best for you, and I think, in that sense, that's just best for me, that's something that I enjoy doing, and I have to when you're talking about a novel is such a marathon, you have to be passionate about it,
Oh, yeah.
and if I feel like I'm doing something and repeating myself, the passion's not there.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons I asked. There's 2 sides to it. There's the pros and the cons, right? And only looking at it through that lens, but some of the pros are that, you're meeting new readers, you're expanding your reach, you're expanding your own artistic um, experience. You're doing all the things that you really enjoy. Some of the cons that people are always worried about are like you mess with the algorithms. I'm trying to sell you these types of books, and you're writing
Mm.
these, and it gets things crossed. But then you go, yeah, it's okay. Like I'll. How many people are finding me purely through the algorithm? Right? It's like
Right, yeah, and,
I'm
I think it would be different if a book really took off. If you had
right,
a book that really took off and you became known for that genre and you wanted to keep, milking that success, that's different,
right,
but I mean, as an indie author and you're trying to find an audience, which is very difficult just to be seen. I think that's the most difficult thing for an indie author is just to be seen because you drown in the masses of people who are also
yeah,
writing and publishing. And so, why not throw out things and see what sticks?
yeah,
And
yep,
that's my thoughts on it. The science fiction novel I'm doing is has an occult element to it, so there is some horror elements to it. So I mean, it does kinda I can always tie it back into
sure,
that when I'm pushing it, but
right,
it's different though. It's different than anything I've ever done, and I wrote it this summer, and I loved doing it.
excellent.
Yeah.
Um, so as we kind of wrap up here, speaking of being seen, where can people see you? Like,
Yeah, so I have a the website that you had mentioned, coyhall.com, and, for the small press, if you're interested in historical horror anthologies and that I'm gonna be editing, I do open calls for those. You can find those at scythianwolf.com and Scythian, scythianwolf.com, and all the open calls will be there. I try to do those through Horror Tree and websites like that too. They also promote those. You'll find those open calls there. But, other than that, on Goodreads, I'm active on Goodreads and on Twitter at Coy Hall Books and Instagram at Coy Hall Books. I try to keep the name the same and the picture the same. So, if you just type in the name and find that black and white picture of me, you'll find me on most social media places, including Blue Sky and Facebook and all of them.
if you guys haven't connected with Coy on any of those socials, I highly encourage you to. That's how we met. Very supportive, very, very kind, very nice person to be connected with. There's no crazy. He
Thank
hasn't
you,
been
yeah.
flooding my DMs with foot pics or anything.
Right, yeah.
I'm a little disappointed,
N
but whatever.
nor begging you to read my book. I don't know which one I would rather receive now, but
Yeah.
both of them get old fast.
Yeah. Now, very, 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 very nice to finally have you on the show, and I can't wait to get you back very soon. Guys, if you haven't ran, like I already gave you the heads up about the book, you got to get out there and pick up A Séance for Wicked King Death. Go do that right now. And if you can't, you need to pre-order it, like because they're gonna release this episode the same week as the book launch, and it sounds like such a fun story. And I'll just put one little plug for people out there that may not be like they may not read much noir crime thriller type work. I love a good palate cleanser as a horror reader. I read tons of horror. I also read tons of other things, and oftentimes I use nonfiction as a palate cleanser. But I love just reading good crime fiction, a good thriller, like just seeing and digesting something a little different. It doesn't have to be drastically different. I mean, it's just it's like a breath of fresh air sometimes, and that doesn't mean that there's been anything wrong with what I've been reading. They could be. I could just read a fantastic story, but I think it's one of the reasons why someone like Stephen King has so much success. Is his books are palate cleansers for the next books, oftentimes
Right.
in his
Yeah.
own catalog. So, if you guys are looking for something a little different, definitely not going to find a book or a story along those same lines anywhere else. Check out Coy's book, A Séance for Wicked King Death. All right, Mr. Coy, thank you so much for joining me all the way from West Virginia, sir.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate you. And guys, make sure you guys are subscribing, all the things. I don't want to sound like some YouTube talking puppet, but go ahead and subscribe to the show. Come on back. We'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you so much.